All right, so today this is going to be our last topic in our ecology unit, and it's all about limiting factors and biogeochemical cycles. So we're going to start with the cycles, and the one that you're most familiar with is probably the water cycle, which is the process of how water in many different forms circulates throughout our environment. So the first process that water can do is it can turn from a liquid into a gas, and that is called evaporation. So this happens on surfaces of lakes on hot days. Water can evaporate and turn into a gas, which would be held as water vapor. It also happens when you're cooking on your stove. If you're boiling water, when it's boiling, the gas that you see coming up is the water turning from a liquid to a gas. The other thing that water can do is go from a gas to a liquid. So we talked about water going from a liquid to a gas. Well, it can do the reverse as well. It can turn from a gas into a liquid, and that is called condensation. This is how our clouds are made, and it's also what causes the windows in the car to fog up sometimes. It's water turning from a gas into a liquid. One that you may not have heard about, and is probably one of the most important ones, especially for the SOL test or end of year test, is called transpiration. And that is when water evaporates from the surface of plants. So plants have water inside of them, and water evaporates from the stems and leaves and petals. And this process actually helps draw water through a plant. And you can think of the T standing for tree, evaporation from a tree, transpiration. And the last thing that we're going to talk about that water does, there are more, but we're just going to talk about the 4, is called infiltration. And this is when water goes through the soil to become stored as groundwater. So water infiltrates through the soil to become groundwater. So that is a water cycle in a nutshell. Now we're going to move on and talk about the carbon cycle. So the main processes in the carbon cycle, the first one we're going to talk about is called combustion. Combustion is burning. Typically, when we're talking about combustion, we're talking about the burning of fossil fuels. So this might be done in a factory. This image over here shows a factory burning fossil fuels from deep in the ground like coal. And that sends carbon into the atmosphere. Another process in the carbon cycle is called respiration. And this releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as well. So humans, when we breathe, we're doing respiration, and we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Fun fact, plants actually do respiration as well. They are not breathing. General respiration is just the process used to make energy, and it does require oxygen, and the way that humans do it is by breathing in the oxygen to make energy. And we release carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So respiration does not necessarily mean breathing. It's just the process used to create energy, and plants do it as well. The third one we're going to talk about from the carbon cycle is called photosynthesis. And this is the process that plants use to make sugar or food by using sunlight. They also use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So photosynthesis itself, using sunlight and carbon dioxide to create sugar and food for plants. I do want to mention carbon cycle is very important because all living things contain carbon. So while it is not mentioned here in the three. The carbon cycle involves lots and lots of different things in our environment. We receive carbon by eating food. So when we eat food, we receive carbon, and that's part of the carbon cycle. When organisms die, the carbon goes into the soil around them, and that is also part of the carbon cycle. So carbon cycles all around us. And that is in large part due to the fact that all living things contain the element carbon. So our question here on our sheet is, which part or parts of the carbon cycle do humans participate in? Now, the main one that we talked about that humans participate in is respiration. And that's because we breathe out carbon dioxide. However, humans can also burn fossil fuels. So we help with combustion. So we do not ourselves combust, no. But humans are responsible for the physical burning of fossil fuels. Humans decide to burn fossil fuels. So we aid in that as well. So that is the carbon cycle. Now we are going to move on to the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen makes up roughly 78% of our atmosphere. However, the nitrogen in the atmosphere is not usable for life. So what that means is, yes, there is nitrogen in the atmosphere all around us. A majority of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. However, when I'm breathing in, and when most organisms breathe in, they're not using nitrogen. They're using either oxygen or carbon dioxide. So the nitrogen in the atmosphere does not contribute to life. But nitrogen itself is necessary for amino acid production. Amino acids are going to build proteins. Our proteins, P-R-O-T-E-I-N, our proteins have nitrogen in them, and therefore we do need nitrogen to survive. But we do not get our nitrogen from the atmosphere. We get our nitrogen from other organisms that we eat, and we're going to talk about how that works here in a minute. So the main process in the nitrogen cycle is called nitrogen fixation. And this process is the one that takes all of the nitrogen in our atmosphere that we have around us that we can't use, and nitrogen fixation makes it usable for living things. So this happens when bacteria on the roots of plants fix the nitrogen and make it usable so that plants can use it. So the word assimilate here that shows up just means so that plants can use it. It's just a fancy word so that plants can use it. The word assimilate just means plants can take it in and use it the way that it needs to be used in their body or inside of them. We don't really consider plants having a body. So consumers, which are organisms that eat, consumers get their nitrogen by eating plants or by eating other animals. So anything that's a heterotroph, including fungi or decomposers, including scavengers, detrivores, omnivores, herbivores, and carnivores, they all get their nitrogen by eating plants or other animals or breaking other animals or plants down. The last process we're going to talk about in the nitrogen cycle is called denitrification. And this is where the bacteria in the soil again convert nitrates back into atmospheric oxygen. So in order for this to actually be a cycle, we have to be able to take it from the atmosphere, put it in the ground, but then again, we also have to be able to take it from the ground and put it in the atmosphere, and therefore then it is a cycle. So putting it back into the atmosphere is called denitrification. And our question for this is, what parts of the nitrogen cycle do bacteria play a part in? So bacteria, again, were very important for nitrogen fixation to make nitrogen usable by plants. But we just said that bacteria also, I can't write that, but that's supposed to be an N there. Bacteria also help out with denitrification. So if you're ever doing an activity about cycles and it's asking something about bacteria doing a job, that's automatically going to be the nitrogen cycle, because that's where bacteria play the most part, is by working with nitrogen. Okay, so that is cycles. That's what we're going to talk about on cycles. There'll be some more activities based on cycles on Canvas. However, right now we are going to go into population growth and then limiting factors. So population growth, populations do not remain static, which means they do not remain the same. They grow, they shrink, they can change in composition, so they do not stay the same over time. Static means same, so they do not remain the same, they change over time. And growth can be positive or negative, meaning numbers can go up or numbers can go down. And it's not really a constant thing. It can be like a hovery, it's always changing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be consistent. One type of growth for populations to exhibit is called exponential growth. And exponential growth is due to the absence of limiting resources. So you have unlimited growth, because you have nothing limiting your growth, and it's going to look like this. Populations go up, 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 up. Over time, nothing holds them back. They just go up, up, up. So when we're talking about limiting resources, we're talking about things that are going to limit the size of your population. So for instance, food. If there's not enough food to feed all the organisms that are being born, your growth is not going to be exponential. It's going to be limited, because you don't have enough food to handle all the organisms. However, if you're looking at a population that is living in a place where there is lots and lots of food, there's lots and lots of places to live, there's lots of water, they're going to exhibit unlimited growth, because they can reproduce at a crazy fast rate and nothing's holding them back. So one of the examples of exponential growth is the human population. There are tons of places to live in the world. Humans have found ways to cultivate enough food and water. Therefore, we exhibit unlimited or exponential growth. Bacteria also exhibit exponential growth as well, because they are very small and they reproduce at a very fast rate. So bacteria also can exhibit this type of growth. So let's take a look at our questions here. What are some characteristics of organisms that demonstrate exponential growth? Typically, except for the human population, organisms that exhibit exponential growth are going to be small, and they reproduce quickly. Is exponential growth sustainable in the long term, and why? So that means over long periods of time, if this graph just kept going over and over and over, over longer periods of time, is it possible for this graph to just keep increasing at that rate? And I would say no. That is not sustainable long term, because eventually something is going to limit the growth of that population. Eventually you're not going to have enough food, you're not going to have enough water. So eventually something will limit growth. Eventually, the human population is going to run out of food, it's going to run out of places to live, probably being first, the way that we're growing. And we're going to start to see this curve level off a little bit, and it's not going to keep going up and up and up. Population growth can also be logistic. And what that means is we have one or more resources becoming less available, therefore the rate of growth in the population will slow. So this might be our growth goes up and up and up and up, and then something happens and it's limited. And this here is what we call our carrying capacity. And what that means is that that's the number of organisms that population can successfully carry. Now I am going to mention, so I'm going to draw this graph, a very similar graph over here to the side. And let's say this is our carrying capacity. I'm just going to label it CC for carrying capacity. Let's say our population grows, goes up, it goes over carrying capacity. That means I don't have enough food or water or whatever it is for that many organisms to live anymore. What's going to happen? The number is going to go back down because some organisms are going to die. And then maybe we go back up over it a little bit, and maybe we come right back down. So carrying capacity isn't going to be the highest point on the graph. It's going to be the average at the top. So my little dotted line is the average between my tops and bottoms here at the top. So just keep that in mind there. What type of growth do humans exhibit? Right now, we are at exponential, but eventually this is going to happen and we are going to reach our carrying capacity because something is going to limit our population. So I'm not going to write anything in that box, and you can explain that. I don't think I have enough room there for me and my computer to write that answer. So again, right now we are exhibiting exponential growth, but eventually we are going to start to level off at carrying capacity as well. Okay, so now we're going to go into limiting factors. We talked about them a little bit. So limiting factors are biotic, which again, biotic means living, or abiotic, which means non-living. So they're living or non-living factors that restricts the growth of a population. The easiest ones to think of are going to be food, water, shelter. However, ones that you might not think about include things like disease. With the coronavirus thing that happened, that was disease showing its ugly head with lots of humans packed in one area. One person gets sick and it spreads like wildfire. That's an example of disease being a limiting factor for a population. So it could be disease against organisms. Some it can be parasites like fleas or ticks causing disease. There's many different you could say. You could say natural disaster. Can also limit your population. So tolerance is going to be the ability of an organism to withstand changes in its environment. And an example that we have over here is salmon are one of the very few species that can tolerate a wide range of salinity levels, meaning salmon can tolerate lots or little salt. And that ability to live somewhere where there's a lot of salt or to live somewhere where there's not that much salt gives them more area to actually live versus some fish. Some fish have to live in a place with just a little bit of salt. If there's too much, they will die. That's going to limit where that fish can live. So when salmon are able to live in places with a wide range of salinity levels or salt levels, it gives them much more places to live. Therefore, they're going to be more tolerant there. And we talked about this before a little bit, but going a bit more in depth into carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the number of organisms of one species that a particular habitat can hold. And carrying capacity is going to be represented with the capital letter K. So carrying capacity is going to be represented with the capital letter K, and it is going to be the number of organisms that a particular area can hold. And carrying capacity is going to be determined by the most limiting resource. So if the most limiting resource that I have is food, food is going to determine my carrying capacity. Populations tend to hover around carrying capacity are called K-selected species. An example of a K-selected species would be humans. Humans tend to hover around their carrying capacity. And let's see if it's on the next slide. Nope. All right, K-selected species are going to typically be large organisms. Larger organisms that reproduce slowly, meaning they only have 1 or 2 babies at a time, and the time it takes that baby to be born is going to be higher. So humans, it takes 9 months for a baby to develop and then be born. They also provide lots of parent care. So once an organism has its baby, then it has to take care of its baby for could be up to several years. And in humans, that can be a large number of years to care for their offspring. And that's going to limit the number of babies that they have. Therefore, they're going to hover right around their carrying capacity. So other examples are organisms like elephants. They don't have terribly many offspring at a time, and they provide lots of parental care. Versus organisms that are called R-selected species. R-selected species are ones that tend to grow exponentially. And the reason that they do that is because they're small, they reproduce quickly, and they provide little or no parental care. So examples of that would be insects. Insects don't care for their offspring. Mice, they have tons of babies at a time and they don't care for their offspring. Bacteria, again, lots of offspring and they don't care for them. What's another one that we could put here? We already got insects, so I can't say roaches, mice, bacteria. I will just leave it at that. Anything that reproduces quickly. Now, some organisms are going to kind of draw the line where it's like, what exactly is that one? Like turtles. They're kind of in the middle. So, K selected again, large, reproduce quickly, reproduce slowly, lots of parental care. R selected species grow exponentially, and they provide little to no parental care. The way that I remember this for me is Miss Ray is a K. So Miss Ray is a K. Humans are K selected. That's one way that I remember that one. Miss Ray is a K. All right, so limiting factors can either be, and there we go. The list that we did before. So limiting factors can be biotic or abiotic. They can be living or non-living, and there are going to be two types of limiting factors that we're going to talk about. We're going to first talk about density dependent. So density dependent factors are going to be things that are going to happen and affect your population no matter the size of their population. So density means size. Dependent means depends on. So density dependent means the size of the population is going to matter in this case. So if your population is small, that's going to mean it affects that population differently than it would a large population. So density dependent factors are going to depend on the size of the population. So if the population size makes a difference in whether that thing hurts it more or hurts it less, or if it even happens at all, that is going to be density dependent, and it depends on the size. Typically, these are going to be biotic factors. The population size is going to matter, and examples include disease. So for the coronavirus we talked about, if humans weren't so packed together in a tight space, the disease wouldn't spread as quickly. And that's why they went to the social distancing thing, because that way people are not packed together in a tight space, and it'll limit the ability of the disease to spread. So the size of the population in that case matters. Another would be competition. With competition, if you had, let's say, I always like to use the example with pizza in a classroom. If I had 4 students in my classroom and 1 pizza, there's no need to compete for slices of pizza because there's 8 slices in a pizza and everybody's going to have 2 already. But if I have a class of 25 and I only have 1 pizza, then I'm going to have competition. So the size of my classroom or the size of my population mattered in that case. Another is going to be predation. If I have 10 predators and 9 prey, they're going to have to fight there. Not everybody's getting food, so predation, the number of predators and the number of prey matters, as well as just plain old food availability. Any time that the number of organisms you have in your population is going to make or break that item. So disease is not going to spread like crazy unless you have a lot of organisms. Competition isn't going to happen unless you have a limited number of things to compete for. Another one is going to be crowding. Crowding cannot happen unless you have lots of organisms. So those are going to be density dependent. The size of the population matters. Whereas density independent The size of the population in this case does not matter at all. And these are going to tend to be abiotic factors, and it's going to be things that are going to harm the population no matter how big it is. For instance, natural disasters. A hurricane, a fire, a tornado, a flood, they're going to roll through an area no matter how many organisms are living there. So it's not like, well, I reached 20 squirrels in my tree, now we're at risk for fire. It's not like that. The risk for fire is the same all the time. The number of squirrels in the tree did not matter. Also, human destruction, so human involvement, human impact. If I'm a person and I get paid for the number of trees that I cut down and bring to my boss, I'm not about to go count how many things are living in the tree and decide if I'm going to cut it down. I'm just going to cut down all the trees no matter what's living there. The number of organisms did not matter in that case. Therefore, that is a density independent factor. So we're going to have some practice with density independent and density dependent to get those straight. Now we're just going to talk a bit more about human impact, because humans can have great effect on populations. So human habitat destruction is going to be the single biggest threat to organisms and biodiversity. Biodiversity means all the different organisms that are able to live in an area. So humans coming in and destroying regions like here in Madagascar, this human habitat destruction is the biggest threat to having organisms eventually go extinct. And it's especially destructive in biodiversity hotspots, which have the greatest diversity of life. So, example, the rainforest has huge biodiversity. Lots of different things live in a rainforest. That means humans can have the most detrimental impacts in those areas. So we're going to say especially destructive in biodiversity hotspots. So biodiversity hotspots have the greatest diversity of life. Therefore, humans are going to have the biggest impact there because they have the biggest number of things that they can harm with. So one thing that can happen due to humans and human activity is extinction of organisms, which is the disappearance of an entire species. So it no longer exists. And a lot of different species are at risk for this. So an example of an organism that's gone extinct would be like dinosaurs, woolly mammoth. The dodo is an example as well. And just prior to an organism going to extinction, they're considered endangered, which means that the number of that species, the number of organisms alive, are very, very low. So low that extinction is going to be probable unless there's some type of intervention made to help the numbers grow up. So, endangered species have low numbers, and extinction is probable. Examples, certain species of pandas and tigers. Zoos are trying to get these animals to breed in captivity to be released to help them not become endangered. And then just prior to an organism species being considered endangered, they are called vulnerable or threatened, meaning they are likely to become endangered. Again, they're likely to become endangered without some type of intervention to prevent further destruction or to help them breed more. An example of that would be the koala. The koala is currently considered vulnerable to becoming endangered. A species is considered exotic if it is not native to an area. So here, where we live, an exotic species would be like the stink bug. They are considered exotic because they're not native to the area. They were not here originally. They've been moved, so they're considered exotic. And another thing that can happen with species is they can become invasive. So invasive, if it thrives in an area where it's not supposed to live. So if I was to bring a snake from a different continent over to the United States and it spread like crazy, and then eventually there was just tons of that snake and no more native snakes, that would be considered invasive. So if it does better than organisms that are natural to an area, it's considered invasive. And then the last impact that humans can have that we're going to talk about on their environment is called global warming. And global warming is the process of the overall temperature on the whole planet warming due to the presence of greenhouse gases being trapped in the atmosphere. And humans contribute to this because we do things like drive cars and have factories and increase pollution. And overall, all this activity that we have increases global warming, therefore the natural temperature of the planet, and it can have detrimental effects. Okay, so there's going to be some practice on this stuff on Canvas. Thank you.